Ethics of Translation. Introduction. It's human tendency to compare things. Translations are always compared with their originals and judged. These judgments come close to interrogating the ethics of selecting the text for translation and strategies used while executing them. The whole question of the production of cultural form called translation is viewed from a moral angle, knowingly or unknowingly. However, one has to concede that ethics is not a homogeneous category, and thus its understanding varies from person to person. Translations as finished products have always stemmed from translators' voice of conscience, commitment to a specific ideology, religious, political, cultural, etc. Bible translation, colonial and post-colonial translation, feminist translation, and a sense of conformity to socio-literary norms and canons. Let's look at various strategies employed by the translator while translating vis-a-vis their implications for the ethical issues involved therein. Strategies of translation. The various strategies used by translators from antiquity can broadly be divided into two categories. In words of Lawrence Venuti, a translation project may conform to the values currently dominating the target language culture, taking a conservative and openly assimilationist approach to the foreign text, appropriating it to support domestic canons, publishing trends, political alignments. Alternatively, a translation project may resist and aim to revise the dominant by drawing on the marginal, restoring foreign texts excluded by domestic canons, recovering residual values such as archaic text and translation methods, and cultivating emergent ones, for example, new cultural forms. Venuti's distinction spells out two broad strategies of translation, that is, domestication and foreignization. Domestication. The domesticating model of translation goes back to Marcus Tullius Cicero, who instructed the translator to undertake the translation of foreign texts in Latin, not through word-for-word model, but freely like an orator. To Cicero, one must imitate the author's virtues, but still retain one's own individuality in translation. English and French traditions of translation are replete with such strategies. In classical Indian tradition of translation, domestication was a norm, almost a religion, rather than an exception. This free-thinking and secular tradition is exemplified in the several hundred versions of Ramayana and Mahabharata. What is interesting is that these versions were not actual translations but a set of free-wheeling rewritings of the original in line with the native spatio-temporal context. Foreignization. Foreignization model conceptually assumes an oppositional stance towards ethnocentric reduction of foreign text to target culture, literally politico-aesthetics. 20th century theorists like Rudolf Panwitz and Walter Benjamin have advocated foreignizing strategies as a way to cultural innovation. One of the best examples of foreignizing strategies of translation can be found in Friedrich Hölderlin's translation of Sophocles, Oedipus Rex and Antigone 1804, which draws on archaic dialects and both dominant and marginal religious discourses. In trying to be faithful to the foreign reading experience, Hölderlin runs the risk of incomprehension and obscurity in his translation. Foreignizing model can be used extensively to resist homogenizing discourses of nation, identity and language, and to reinvent oppositional cultures of non-essentializing ways. Instead of desiring to melt two texts into sameness, the translator beholds them as different identities and merges them into one, into a third space which offers a hybridity of cultures, a space where differences are valued and respected. Ideology and translation. Translation was and still is deeply implicated in ideology. It can be seen in the grisly fate of translators such as Tyndale and Dollett and assassination of Japanese translator of Rushdie's Satanic Verses. With spread of deconstruction and cultural studies, the subject of ideology of power relations became important area of study, and it has influenced the research and theory in translation studies as well. The questions that still trouble theorists in the field have psychological, sociological, and cultural underpinnings. Is all human activity ideologically motivated? How can one differentiate between ideology and culture? Tejaswini Niranjana answers this question insightfully by saying that translation and translation studies have caught in an idiom of fidelity and betrayal that assumes an unproblematic notion of representation. That ideology in particular and the act of translation in general is subservient to the cause and agenda of representation. That what and how to represent in translation go into deciding the specific strategy of translation that would work for that representation. Thus, ideology is inextricably tied up with socio-cultural context, and the act of translation means more than the purely humanistic notion of building bridges between culture and languages. Target text orientation. Polysystem theory, which brought about cultural turn in translation studies, views literature as larger system comprising various subsystems that vie with each other for dominant position. In the literary polysystem, thus there is a constant friction between high literary genres like poetry, novel, drama, and the low ones like children's literature, popular fiction, and translations. Generally, the control factor within the literary system doesn't allow a translation to fall out of step with the poetics and ideology of the time. This happens when translation is being done from a less powerful language like Gujarati, Marathi, or Hindi to a powerful language like English or French. That is why Gideon theory, descriptive translation studies, insists on examining all translation-related issues historically in terms of the conditions which operate in the target culture. This is what Tejaswini Niranjana means by examining the historicity of the translated text. That is, questions such as who did the translation, how, why, and what is the impact of the translation. She examines the historicity of translation of classical Indian works into English and notes that the translators were always European missionaries or colonial administrators, since the Indians themselves were not considered worthy and were governed by a desire to purify Indian culture and make it seem more English. Here, translation strategically reproduce the colonized subject as the other of the European metropolitan subject and contemporary Indian culture as static, unchanging, and ahistorical. Translation was thus significant technology of colonial domination. Translation was thus significant technology of colonial domination. However, at times, translations can be used by marginal groups and languages such as polemical weapons to challenge the dominant poetics. They subscribed to the assimilative or subversive politics of translation, as Harish Trivedi calls it. A fine instance of such Occidentalism is Govind Mishra's reworking of Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, into Athara So Satara, a politically and ideologically charged Oriya adaptation manifesting its author's anti-colonial, anti-English stance. Source text orientation. Because of various historical reasons that affect marginalized groups within societies like women, Dalits, blacks, and the erstwhile colonized, radical source-oriented theories of translations have been articulated in 20th century. Scholars like Antoine Berman, Lawrence Venuti, and Tejaswini Niranjana privilege the SL culture and prescribe foreignism and literalism as a way of asserting ideological concerns and politics in translation. Niranjana privileges literalness over meaning or the word paradigm over the sentence, syntagm to attack homogenizing and continuous narratives. By critiquing 18th century translations of Indian texts, Niranjan urges post-colonial people to reclaim translation as a site for resistance and transformation. Just as feminist translators have foregrounded a concept of woman handling of texts, Dalit scholars and writers in India have voiced their concern over the issue of a valid and authentic representation of difficulties and trauma of Dalit life in Indian society. There is an increasing belief in Dalits as the legitimate representatives of their issues, problems, language, literature, and translation. Sherry Simon rightly puts it, the post-colonial frame of Spivak's Politics of Translation aims at revising the terms of cultural exchange as Tagore knew when he translated his own work. It is no longer a question of reshaping Indian literature into Anglo-American frame, but of distorting the frame of reception itself.